Right, good evening, everyone. My name is Carol Homden. I'm the Group Chief Executive of Coram, the continuing Foundling Hospital, the first and longest continuing children's charity. And we're going to, I hope, have a rich set of discussions this evening. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping things to mention. The first thing is we are planning to record this event and upload it online in future. So please do let us know if you are not comfortable with this or to remain off camera, for example. If we could ask you to stay muted throughout the presentations unless we call upon you to ask a question. And we recommend having your video off and your Zoom set to speaker mode if you then do that. Following our speakers tonight, there will be a question and answer session. Indeed, I hope more of a discussion. So if you would like to enter any thoughts into the chat, that would be great. And then I might theme the points or questions or come to you in order to involve you in that discussion. You can, of course, raise your hand at any point. But we're trying not to treat this as a kind of seminar, but more of a discussion. And we shall be very pleased to hear questions and short commentary. If you have any technical issues during the event, please message the host privately or put a message in the event chat, and we will do what we can to help with any issues. Right, so housekeeping over, we will move to start. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. This is an event put together by the Coram Society and In Between Lines. And our speakers will explain something more about each of those. But the Coram Society is the term we give to the opportunity to discuss together the issues and meanings of our past and our present to inform the future and are open to the public. In Between Lines is a group of young people whose leader, leader is perhaps the wrong word, but certainly convener, Anthony Lynch, is with us today. And I shall say a little more about each of those, and they will introduce themselves, along with Hannah Dennett, who joins us from the University of Warwick, where she has been undertaking PhD research. And well done, Hannah, in achieving the submission. We are fingers crossed for hearing of success following your submission shortly. And this event is being put on tonight as part of our contribution to Black History Month, which began at Coram on the 2nd of October with a conference by Coram Intercountry Adoption Centre on intersectionality between race, other forms of diversity, and special educational needs and disabilities. And tonight's theme that we have chosen is to examine the forgotten foundlings, to explore voicelessness and invisibility in our history. And so I am particularly delighted to be that this idea has been put together by Anthony and Millie and Hannah in order to allow us to explore those who we do not hear about from Coram's distinctive history and archive. One of the things to note at the moment that this coincides with work under a programme we call Voices Through Time, The Story of Care, which is a major National Lottery Heritage funded project to digitise the most vulnerable 25% of Coram's archival records of the children supported in the Foundling Hospital over the first 2 centuries of our existence, from 1739 up to around 1900. And of course, at the time when these records were being created, children in society had no voice. Children, indeed, women had few, if any, inheritance or other rights in relation to their children. And children were to be seen and not heard and that is if they were seen. And Thomas Coram, of course, walking the streets of London, was a remarkably progressive man by the standards of his day. He saw the bodies of infants on the streets of London and campaigned for 17 years to create this charity as the Foundling Hospital to provide care and education and support, and thereby was the foundation of children's rights in a very important way, and the birthplace of children's social care. And we will examine a little further after the presentations on the ways in which history is interpreted and reinterpreted and by whom, and also some of the issues today about continuing voicelessness and invisibility in society and in the story of care. So I will not say a great deal more at the moment on our current work, except that it is worth noting that we are today the proud inheritors of the work of Voice of the Child in Care, now Coram Voice, which was, when it was established in 1975, was the first champion of children's advocacy. So first of all, we are going to hear two presentations from our distinguished speakers before coming back together to explore together the important themes that they have raised. So first of all, I am delighted to welcome Hannah Dennett, who has been researching within the Coram archive for some years, I believe, and whose work was produced with the Foundling Museum into the special exhibition that they ran entitled Tiny Traces. And I'm going to leave Hannah to say more about that and herself, and I look forward to her rich presentation. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here. Yeah, my PhD project is an AHRC Midlands 4 Cities funded collaborative doctoral award, which is a right mouthful, and that's been with the University of Warwick and in conjunction with the Foundling Museum. And the aim of it has been to uncover the lives of children of colour that were admitted into the Foundling Hospital in the long 18th century. And part of that project was that I created the exhibition Tiny Traces, which featured some of the findings that I'd come across in the archival research that I've undertaken. I'm currently an early career fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study at Warwick University. And as Carol said, I've just submitted my PhD thesis, which is exhilarating and also quite nerve-wracking. Just to start off with a warning, some of the language used in the archival material that I referred to in my talk is racist and no longer acceptable. And it also contains a case of the physical abuse of a child, just to prepare you for that. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So on the 8th of May, 1741, at 2:15, a male child was admitted into London's Foundling Hospital. The scrap of paper on which these details were recorded by the hospital staff also included a list of the clothing the child wore at the time of his admission. At the bottom of the paper were written the words, "of a very tawny complexion." This is the earliest reference to a child's skin colour that I've encountered in the Foundling Hospital archives. The Foundling Hospital had no official policy for recording the race or ethnicity of a child or their parents when it accepted a baby. Yet the billet of Foundling number 75, who was later christened July Green, reveals that Black and mixed heritage children were present in the hospital. This therefore raises several questions. What were the experiences of these children as foundlings? How can we discover something of their lives without first-hand accounts? And what is the significance of doing so for understanding the care experiences of children of colour in the past? It was typically only when the poorer ranks of society, including people of colour, came into contact with institutions and officialdom that any traces of their lives were recorded. Often this contact occurred at times of difficulty and distress, which can therefore skew our view of their experiences overall. However, the records of the Foundling Hospital are a valuable source from which it is possible to excavate fragments of the lives of Black and mixed heritage children who would otherwise remain forgotten. So today I will show how my research has been able to uncover the lives of children of colour in the archives and has used the findings to create case studies about individual children, which allow their stories to be told and their voices heard in some small part. The starting points for my research were the billets and the mother's petitions. July Green's billet is unusual as it was handwritten. Later, the hospital produced printed forms which were completed when a child was admitted. At the bottom of each form was a section, marks on the body, and it's here that we find notes about the skin colour of children. References were made to children who were described in terms such as a tawny, like a Moor, a Negro, and a mulatto. These were all commonly used terms in the period to describe people who appeared to be non-white. Kathleen Chater's research on parish records has highlighted the use of 29 different terms used to describe people of colour. And this demonstrates the difficulties in accurately identifying people's true ethnicities, as many terms were used interchangeably and were also very much based on the interpretation of the typically white person and their understanding of the world when they created the record. So using the billets has yielded 11 such references to individual children. Can I have the next slide, please? As we can see here, the billet form for founding number 7766, a male child admitted on the 18th of March, 1758, under marks on the body, we can see the note, a black child. He became Caesar Canda and was sent to be nursed by Mary Draper of St Andrews in Midgham, Berkshire, under the inspection of Mrs. Points. Sadly, Caesar died of a fever, aged only 2 months. Mother's petitions focused on the circumstances of the mother and her pregnancy. At times, they included references to her place of origin, which provided an indication that her child might have been black or of mixed heritage. Notes were regularly added to petitions after inquiries were made to verify the truth of a mother's story, and some of these contain information about the father, which also suggest that the child was not white. So I can have the next slide, please. Notes added to the petition of Susanna Wright recorded that the father of her child, George Clark, was a man of colour. They had met as fellow servants at Mr. Lascelles of Knockhill House, Dumfriesshire, Scotland. George promised marriage to Susanna, and after she fell pregnant, they left Scotland to travel to London, where they found lodgings at number 4 Quebec Street. After a week, George deserted Susanna, who was about 5 months pregnant at the time. George was thought to have gone to Liverpool, but he could not be located. Susanna had managed to support herself and her newborn baby using some savings before she petitioned the Foundling Hospital in June 1804. And her daughter became founding number 18757 and was christened Fanny Kenyon. From these initial findings, I used the unique identification number given to each child to search for them in other hospital records, such as the nursery books and apprenticeship indentures. This allowed me to start to piece together their time in the institution, and in total, I've identified 22 children of colour. Some were children of women of the African and Asian diasporas, and others were born to white mothers who'd had sexual encounters or relationships with men of colour. All the mothers of these children were subjected to the same admission processes as those mothers of white children, which suggests that the status of the children as illegitimate infants of women of the labouring poor was the important factor in their admission, rather than the colour of the children's skin. Once the children were admitted, like white children, they were christened with new names and sent to be cared for by wet nurses and their families in the counties surrounding London, and in several cases in Yorkshire near to the Ackworth Branch Hospital. I've found no evidence to suggest that inspectors faced difficulties in placing children of colour with nurses. However, it's when black and mixed heritage children were at nurse that we encounter wildly differing examples of the care they received. Founding number 8058 was admitted by ballot on the 10th of April 1758. Under marks on the body, the male infant was described as a Negro. He became James Moore and was sent to be nursed by Esther Bevitt of Warmfield at Heath, near Wakefield in Yorkshire. The inspector for the area was Lady Dalston, whose husband Sir George was the governor of the hospital. Can I have the next slide, please? We find 2 references to James Moore in the correspondence of Lady Dalston to the governors. Included in a letter dated 26th of January 1759, Lady Dalston wrote, "Most of the children under my care are pretty well, except the black, who is very sickly, and I am in great fear for him. but he has all imaginable assistants, Dr. Cookson, who is a most excellent physician, giving him advice and attendance. Next slide, please. The letter was soon followed by another on 19th of February, in which Lady Dalston stated, I am very sorry to acquaint you that a few days ago died my little negro, James Moore, number 8058. I had Dr. Cookson every assistance as much as if he'd been my own child, but it was all in vain. He was a child very gross and full of humours. I will send the certificate of his burial in a post or two. I now have 15 under my care and don't choose any more at present, except it should be a black boy. And then I would, if you please, to give me notice, send me a nurse for it, as Sir George has a great mind to have one brought up. These letters demonstrate that medical care was provided for foundlings who fell ill whilst at nurse, including children of colour, and suggest the health of black and mixed children was considered to be as important as that of white infants. From the language Lady Dalston used, it appears she felt strong affection for James Moore. Her comment about her husband, Sir George's desire to have a black child raised in their household may have been part of the motivation for the care shown to James, in the hope that he would, in time, become their black page boy. It was fashionable to have usually enslaved black boys as page boys in wealthy homes of the period. They would be dressed in the finest livery and treated as the mistress's pet, flaunting the wealth of the family and their connections to the wider British Empire. It suggests a certain novelty factor associated with the presence of James, as he was most likely the only child of colour in the parish. Aspects of self-interest and benevolence were likely both at play on the part of Lady Dalston. Next slide, please. The case of foundling number 6324, Noah Watkins, stands in stark contrast to the care shown to James Moore. Noah was admitted into the Foundling Hospital in November 1757 and sent to be nursed by Mary Norton at Twyford, Berkshire. In a letter to the governors from Inspector Theophilus Hughes, dated October 1759, we learn of the terrible treatment Noah suffered whilst at nurse. Hughes wrote, out of 9 children removed by me, there could be but 2 dry children, which are John Wigmore, number 6097, and Noah Watkins, whose number I forgot, it being dead, and the paper returned last year. These 2 children were taken out of the hospital by Mary Norton, October 26, 1757, and removed to Mary Butcher, October 17, 1758. And the reason of removing them was notorious for the whole neighbourhood, viz. Noah Watkins having received such a contusion under its breast, almost big enough to thrust a fist into, and a total neglect of it being a black. And of this contusion, it languished and soon died after its removal. The horrifying details of the wound suffered by James and the lack of action taken by his nurse was certainly the result of neglect and most probably of direct physical abuse. Hughes wrote that the neglect of Noah was because he was a black, indicating that he believed Mary Norton's treatment of Noah was motivated by his skin colour. Noah was noted to be a tawny child on his billet. Though only one example, Noah Watkins' experience is evidence that prejudices against children of colour did impact the care they received. Ultimately, the neglect Noah suffered led to his premature death. 9 black and mixed heritage children survived infancy and returned to the hospital aged around 4 or 5 years. 4 of them died in the hospital as the result of catching contagious diseases. However, the death rates of these children in infancy and early childhood reflect the high rates of infant and child mortality generally experienced by children under the care of the Foundling Hospital. One child, Anne Watson, was successfully reclaimed by her Indian mother, Martha Green, in 1786. That's a fascinating case that I don't have the time to talk about, but I can always add more later if you want to know more. Only 4 of the children I've identified lived to be apprenticed. Miles Cook, who was apprenticed into sea service, Thomas Jaycox, who was apprenticed to George Flowers, a wharfinger, Mary Lammas, who was apprenticed to William Franklin, a black ship's cook in the West India trade, noted in the committee minutes to be a black cook, and Fanny Kenyon, the daughter of Susanna Wright and George Clark, who was apprenticed as a domestic servant. To my knowledge, there are no incidents in the archival material which recorded the thoughts, feelings, or opinions of the children to which they referred. Every experience of a child was mediated through the governors, hospital staff, and inspectors. We have no sense of what they thought about their time as foundlings. We also know nothing of their desires for the future, the kind of jobs they would have liked to be trained in, or how they felt about leaving the confines of the hospital as they started their apprenticeships. Some may have been apprehensive, having little or no experience of life in the metropolis and only distant memories of living as part of a family and in a community. Others may have been relieved or excited to be starting the next chapter of their lives. With the remainder of this talk, I want to discuss the life of Fanny Kenyon and show how, by undertaking a close reading of the archival material and using some inference and imagination, we can sometimes catch glimpses of the character and personality of these children. Can I have the next slide, please? Miss Eliza Mackenzie petitioned the hospital in March 1814, requesting to have Fanny Kenyon as her apprentice, a servant. Miss Mackenzie previously had several foundling children as apprentices, so Fanny might have become known to her through the previous contact with the matron at the hospital. In her letter to the governors, Miss Mackenzie stated that she wished to have Fanny as her apprentice because, knowing the prejudices existing against children of colour and thinking that in my small family I could bring her up to be useful to herself without her suffering the many mortifications she would be liable to in many families. Next slide, please. In support of Miss Mackenzie's request, the matron of the hospital wrote to the governors informing them that Fanny is an excellent child of good capacity and none in the house of her age reads or works better. This indicates that Fanny was receiving the same education and training as other girls during her time in the institution, and that she excelled in both, being a bright young girl. She was clearly highly thought of by the matron. Miss Mackenzie's reference to the possible challenges Fanny would face as a child of colour outside the confines of the hospital is only the second reference I've encountered, which speaks to the possible racism and prejudices faced by Black and mixed children, and is likely the reason that the governors agreed to apprentice Fanny to Miss Mackenzie, even though she was only 9 years of age at the time. Fanny spent over 4 years in Miss Mackenzie's household, and then, for some unknown reason, she left in 1818. What followed was a difficult period for Fanny, during which she was apprenticed to 5 other masters, before arriving in the household of Mr. Joseph Glaskin, a silk manufacturer, in September 1822. Next slide, please. Oh, can I have the next slide? Yeah, thank you. A newspaper report in the Morning Herald on the 27th of October 1822 tells us that Fanny's life had taken a disastrous turn. The report said that Fanny had initially settled well in her job as a servant in the Glaskin household, stating Fanny was pleased with her mistress and her mistress had every reason to be pleased with Fanny. However, after a couple of weeks, Fanny became morose and neglectful of her duty, and at the end of the 5th week, she and her mistress mutually agreed to part. When Fanny was leaving the house, Mr. Glaskin asked to look in her box of belongings, where he discovered numerous silk purses. Fanny was brought before the magistrate, where Mr. Glaskin appealed on her behalf that she be shown leniency. But the magistrate said the law must take its course. Fanny appeared at the Old Bailey on the 23rd of October and was charged with grand larceny. She was found guilty and sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment. It's unclear why Fanny's attitude in her new job changed, especially as initially she had seemed happy there. The reference in the newspaper article to 2 other people to whom she planned to take the stolen items, and the fact that she'd already stolen other items in the previous weeks, suggests that at some point after she began working for the Glaskin family, she may have been manipulated into stealing from her master. Mr. Glaskin's support for Fanny suggests that he felt some sympathy for her situation, and is again perhaps an indicator that life for Black and mixed heritage foundlings was particularly challenging. Next slide, please. After Fanny's release from prison, she was admitted in February 1823 into the temporary refuge for the destitute in Hackney. This was set up to help women who'd been imprisoned, providing them with somewhere to live and to help them find useful employment or reconnect with family and friends. It wasn't long before Fanny was brought before the refuge's governors. On the 22nd of March, the committee minutes recorded that saw Fanny Kenyon, who says that the superintendent has said, she having been discovered in some dishonest practice, that he would not recommend any person guilty of theft to a situation, and that it would therefore be useless to continue lodge in this house. That she has several articles of clothing at the Glaskins where she last lived as a servant, which she wishes to be at liberty to inquire after, and that she knows a Mrs. Franklin, a muffin baker's in Clerkenwell, to whom she can go for a lodging. Upon being admonished, the secretary undertaking to see Mrs. Franklin, she consented to reconsider her request. Despite the absence of Fanny's own words, this extract is as close as we get to hearing her voice. She was clearly frustrated that she would not be recommended for a job as a servant, and therefore felt it was pointless remaining in the refuge. She also asked for permission to recover her clothing from the Glaskins' household, despite the fact that she'd stolen from Mr. Glaskin. It also shows that she had some form of network as she wished to leave and lodge with a Mrs. Franklin. I think this extract highlights Fanny's spirit. She wanted to take some control of her life and was unafraid to contact the Glaskins despite all that had happened. Fanny did remain in the refuge, but 2 further complaints about her behaviour were made in May and then June, when she was reprimanded for being disorderly and idle. Fanny then disappears from the records, and I've been unable to discover any further information about her. The stories of Black and mixed heritage children taken into the Foundling Hospital in the 18th century, and especially the story of Fanny Kenyon, provide unique insights into the lives and experiences of children of colour in the 18th and early 19th century London. Their voices and experience are never represented in their own words, but always mediated through the eyes and interpretations of others. However, the recovery of their lives from the archives ensures that they are no longer forgotten foundlings and can become a visible part of the history of the Foundling Hospital. Thank you. Last slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for those fascinating insights and some very interesting stories and explorations that you have made from the archive. As you say, we hope to bring those stories forwards as part of the ongoing development of Voices Through Time. Now, we're not going to pause there. We're going to hear straight away from Anthony Lynch, with a very different perspective from the modern era. And Anthony, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're well. And thank you, Hannah, for that amazing and so insightful just talk. And I've been to the archives, and it's been, it's pretty hard to read the stuff there. So it's amazing that you managed to decipher that for yourself. So I am a mixed non-binary adoptee. I was adopted through Coram. I now work with them with my project In Between Lines. So that's something that I started with Zoe and Esther, who are my colleagues at the University of Exeter. And it's basically about exploring lived experience of being from multiple identities. And so we started with an exhibition in Exeter, and we have since toured the country in Cornwall, London, at Coram during that time, and Leeds. And we're hoping to continue that. And alongside that, we've started an online community with a website and blog where we are trying to get people with lived experience to tell their story, to give the voice back to people who have not had a voice. And also, I do freelance work with other sort of agencies, such as I work with Mind and other adoption agencies, which is all about trying to embed lived experience into these organizations. So when I found out I was going to be following Hannah, I knew that I would have to try and turn my lived experience into some kind of lived expertise. So in this talk, I'm going to be blending my own experience as an adoptee of colour with sort of my experience working freelance and with Coram over the past few years, while also adding some academic papers to do with the voicelessness of care experienced individuals. I will also use the term adoptee and care experience interchangeably. I know there is 100% a difference of that, and a lot of adoptees are care experienced. But for example, I was adopted at 20 months, so I don't have that. I guess I am care experienced in like an unconscious way, and I still see my foster mum, but it's definitely a different experience to care leavers. But the way that I sort of think about the care experience adoptee difference or similarities is that we're both descendants or spiritual descendants of the Foundling Hospital children, which has changed as social practice, policy, and Coram has changed. And the reason why I want to sort of do this talk and what I feel like I can add is that it's easy to think that stories that Hannah have mentioned, which are so rich but also so sad, it's easy to think of them as relics of the past with no bearing on the present, but these stories persist today. Context is different. Obviously, Foundling hospitals don't exist in the same way. and those children weren't adopted, but there are common themes in their experience of voicelessness that I would like to take the time to examine over the next few minutes. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I want to talk about, an essential factor in voicelessness, is trauma. And I feel like that's a word that's gone around a lot and is being talked about a lot in the sort of social care and mental health context. But yeah, I'm going to be using this definition from the UK Trauma Council, where distressing events are so extreme and intense they can overwhelm a person's ability to cope, resulting in lasting negative impact. So I'm going to sort of assume that for care experienced individuals, there's going to be some trauma being realized either in the act of separation from the biological or foster family, and also in the circumstances that precipitated or prompted the act of separation. And so you've got that trauma, but alongside that, for adoptees of color or care experienced, adoptees of color, experienced children of color, there is the additional wound of being severed from your customs and your culture, and that's sort of within a whole sort of wider context of like post-slavery, colonialism, and diaspora. So I know for myself that I've had to live and work through a lot of trauma and lived with a lot of hollowness, fear, and anxiety, which made it really hard to tell my story and to feel like people would listen to me and that my story was really important. And so I guess that's the private aspect of Gray's paper on trauma within the context of his paper is within communication studies. So on the one hand, you have care experienced individuals who can't tell their story because they just don't have the sort of somatic healing to express it. But then on the other side of that, you also have the stigma that's created from not being able to express your identity in the interpretation of life events. So yes, the stigma results from an inability to resist narratives of brokenness, behavioral problems, an inability to master wound. And there's this paper actually commissioned by the University of Oxford and Coram Voice in 2020, which said that 1 in 8 children in care feel as though they've been made to feel embarrassed about being a child in care. And that's what the picture on the right is about. And I can definitely remember in my experience of growing up as an adoptee in school, not wanting to talk about myself, being bullied for being adopted, being bullied for being a child of color. And those things just eventually chip at your ability to talk about yourself and to tell your story and to feel like you're going to be listened to. That's the personal factors. If we move on to the next slide, I want to talk about something which is a little less direct and sort of just is more of a cultural and contextual factor. And that's to do with the narratives that we see portrayed throughout the literature and the media. And so despite this historic lack of lived experience that we've seen with Anna's talk right through to the present day, these sorts of storylines of orphaned or care experienced or adoptee characters feature hugely. And I wanted to do the story of Oedipus because that's written by Sophocles 2,000 years ago. And it's clear that, at least in the Western tradition, there is this constant line of children and stories of people who have been orphaned or adopted and are having to sort of process that and having to live through that. And I say it's quite a unique phenomenon compared to other intersectionalities. And so why is that the case? And there is this fascinating podcast by Lem Sisse, who we definitely need to come to in Between Lines event because he's so good. He argues that without the safety net of family, these characters have to work out who they are and how they connect with the world by themselves. And so because they do that, they have to fully realize their potential in an identity sense. And obviously, alongside that, you have lots of compelling issues regarding family, class, race relations, nature versus nurture. It's no wonder why these kind of stories are super prevalent and popular. And also, to be clear, I'm not really commented on whether that's like a good or a bad thing, because I, for one, really love comic books. I love Superman. I really enjoyed watching Harry Potter. I haven't read the books, which is a bit embarrassing, but I probably should. But it's just a really interesting sort of contextual factor where you'd expect nothing to be sort of talked about with care experience, but it's so prevalent in the sort of popular imagination. And so I guess the reality of that is that media portrayals written by people without lived experience, they show care experience as an adventure or as a magical fairy tale. And even if it is written like an accurate way, it's still not written by people with lived experience. It's not the reality. It contributes to the voicelessness. I'd also like to say that alongside the children or the main characters, also stereotypes the context of their adoption or their experience, where biological parents are either revered or reviled, similarly with sort of adoptive parents. And so it kind of just obfuscates what adoption actually is and what it's like for the people involved. Yeah, so I'd like to go on to the next slide, please. Finally, I'd like to talk about more directly about the institutional factors. I've really sort of discovered this since working more directly in sort of the social care context. And also, obviously, with National Adoption Week being past, lived experience is slightly more at the forefront. It kind of just highlights the lack of lived experience the rest of the year, where the emphasis is on recruitment rather than lived experience. And I think on the Friday, I looked up 5 or 6 foster/adoption websites, big ones. And the only one that did end up having something was Coram. So well done, Coram, for doing that. And yeah, that's the Peter Capaldi Voices Creative Writing Competition. The rest of these websites, there was absolutely nothing. And I think that's a problem, because the emphasis is on getting children adopted and making sure they're safe, but there's absolutely no sort of consultation, their lived experience afterwards. And the only time that they do tend to be consulted is during National Adoption Week. And that also tends to be in the context of recruitment rather than just getting them to tell their story. It also seems to be a funding issue, seems to be a research issue, seems to be a priority issue. It's multifaceted, and I think it's something that people are trying the best that they can. Like, I think obviously social workers and people in care are trying really hard, but it's a structural problem, an institutional problem that needs to start being looked at. The second one is sort of more specific about care experienced individuals or care leavers, is the care cliff. And so that's this kind of idea that once people turn 18, once care leavers turn 18, they have to kind of look after themselves and have to become an adult before the rest of us do. So we can see from Palmer's, Ayal's paper that despite the trauma related to their placement history, young people aging out are expected to adapt to adulthood at a younger age and at a faster pace than their non-care peers. So, I mean, I'm obviously a beneficiary of this. I'm adopted. I'm currently doing this talk from my house, and that's a privilege relative to care leavers, because I've had the time, like other people, to, you know, get my life together and work out my sort of adoption story and identity story. But for a lot of care experience people, they don't have the ability to do that, so they never get to express who they are. And I'd also like to say that extends to therapeutic support too. We had an earlier conversation panel last week, National Adoption Week, with older generation adoptee, and we were talking about how the Adoption Support Fund, which is very useful, and I used it as well, and personally, which helps people get funded therapy. It ends once you turn 22, and that is way too early, for an adoptee who have processed everything to do with their identity. And it kind of is scary when you're doing therapy and you know that you've only got a couple sessions left, and then after that you don't really have any money to afford it. And the waiting list is so long for adoptees that, yeah, it's not a good thing for young adoptees to be going through, and it needs to be extended. Next slide, please. So I do have some solutions. There are a lot of problems currently. There's also a lot of good work being done, but yeah, I hope this has begun to show the extent of the problem from several different levels. So the first thing that needs to be done, and I know that this is within a context of, lots of financial insecurity for the care field. What needs to happen is that there needs to be more resources available for therapy. There needs to be lots of somatic therapies available for adoptees who have trauma embedded in their lives from the very beginning. Most of my traumatic experiences happened in my first 2 years of my life. And when I get therapy, it can't just be talking therapy. It needs to be somatic, body-based to help process and free. And I'm very fortunate to have had that experience. A lot of people don't. So there needs to be that implemented, but also there needs to be more opportunities for expressing lived experience. So more conversation panels, need to be more writing competitions, needs to be more funding for adoptees to write poetry, experienced people to express themselves through dance, to really just sort of begin to understand who they are and what happened to them. So that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing, which is what In Between Lines is trying to do, is to show positive representation of care experience, trying to counter those sorts of narratives of brokenness and narratives not written by adoptees. We need to see stories of people who are succeeding, who are adoptees and are living healthy lives. And yeah, just in a way, in showing the variety of lives that you can live as well, where people can be creative and express their identity in lots of creative ways. Again, kind of like Lemsisse, making those narratives available for younger children, because I feel like when I was younger and growing up, there wasn't any role model for me. There wasn't anyone who I could be like, oh, this is a adoptee who's doing really well, and it's only taken years of getting into this world and understanding it, see those narratives, and that needs to be happening from when people were young, from when they're teenagers. And finally, on an institutional level within sort of the care field, we need to embed lived experience at all levels. The onus is on the agencies to develop community and the voice with the people who are the most important parts of the agency or the work that they're doing, which is the children. There needs to be peer support. There needs to be peer mentoring workshops run by people with lived experience, because I think adoptees won't go to things, experienced individuals won't go to things if they don't see themselves represented in the people running them. And that needs to happen through, having budgets specifically for lived experience, user voice and support. And I guess above that whole level, there needs to be more working with government and funding agencies, because I just don't think there is enough funding available for adoptee voice at the moment. And yeah, just making sure that also we're employing people with lived experience. And it's been really lovely to have been working with Coram for the past 6 months. But that needs to continue once In Between Lines goes independent. So that's the end of my talk, and I hope you guys have found it interesting. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and for sharing some details of your personal journey also. Those are the academic references, which can be also made available to you afterwards. Might I suggest that we take the slides down at this point, so that by the tyranny of Zoom, as it were, we can actually see ourselves as a community of people able to discuss and explore some of these themes. As you gather your thoughts, and please do make use of the chat if that is your most comfortable means, or put up your hands. Forgive me if I don't see your hand initially, because quite a lot of you. But I just wanted to make two follow-up remarks as you're gathering your thoughts. The first is that Anthony made reference to the Voices writing competition, and that was specifically created by Coram Voice. And Rosemary, I can see you there on screen, Rosemary, who has supported that competition and was part of Coram Voice board in doing it, particularly to enable young children of many ages, actually, through to young people leaving care, to be able to come together as a community on a key theme, and to share their talents and their stories. It is a unique platform. It's live now, and we would appreciate all the help in publicising it to any children who may benefit from it. And there will indeed be an award ceremony with the redoubtable Peter Capaldi in the new year. The second thing is the importance of the individual story aggregating is a collective story as well. And Hannah touched upon that actually in terms of the importance of just the fact that there is evidence within the Coram archive, albeit threads that we need to stitch together. It is still a very important record. And today Coram Voice works to conduct surveys that enable children's lived experience to be captured from their point of view in terms of subjective well-being in a co-production approach, but also then so that the power of those voices can be, we hope, amplified and accentuated for policy. So we've got a number of interesting questions that are coming through. And I wonder whether we might start with the historical and then come back to the present. There's a question you can probably see there, Hannah, but whether the tokenization of Black and mixed identity children mentioned continues to have power through the archive. So you've mentioned several from the earlier period. Did your research go through longer? And then, what do we know and what does it indicate in terms of the sort of later period of care?
So I looked at some petitions going up to about 1820 and at that point they changed, they didn't do the billet forms anymore, and they changed to printed forms that women just completed. So I actually found that there was even less available information because it had all been standardized. Rather than having the sort of the snippets of individual stories that you get coming through because the petitions previously had been written. So my sense was when I looked at the billets, when those references to children's skin color were included in that section, that it was about using that as an identifier for each child in case that the mother returned, because in the same section you get references to children being twins, you get references to maybe they've got one child I came across had a club foot. And because they didn't have the details about the parents, but parents could potentially come back and reclaim them, they needed to identify these children. So I feel like initially those were why the remarks were recorded in the first place. as another form of identification, because obviously there were so few children of colour in the hospital. But yeah, I don't know. I really wanted to go past perhaps the end of slavery and see whether things changed then. But I wonder if it will be possible to recover the same details because it becomes standardized in the recording, unless some references are made in passing when they send the children out to nurse and they jot down something then. But I think because the systems were in place later on, with the receipts that mothers were given in case they needed to reclaim their children, and with the standardizing of forms, I'm not sure that it will be possible to recover the lives of those children in the same way. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Thank you, Hannah. And, this is one of the, it's often said that what is measured is important within data collection. And there has been change through time in terms of the ways in which information is captured. And indeed, I think we're in a rather dynamic period now also about changes to self-identification as well as other forms of codification. And these are very important aspects for, we can't look back and see what wasn't there, if you sort of mean, what wasn't captured. So it is a very tricky problem indeed. Anthony, when you visited the archive, and you've spent some time examining the case studies, what came to the fore from the historic record, and how does that kind of strike you in relation to the modern perspective that you were bringing to bear?
I think from what I saw, and there was this really interesting conversation about this apprentice who was having like behavioral issues. That's how they kind of described it in the archives. But again, it was really interesting how it was very paternalistic. It was essentially it was like a dispute about the apprentice was complaining about sort of his like setting and where he was staying, and he was complaining about the treatment he was receiving. And they sort of had this panel, and one, they did not consult really. There was no perspective of the apprentice in the record at all. It was only about his master, and they ended up saying something along the lines of the apprentice's habits are gross and filthy, and there is absolutely nothing for him to complain about, essentially. And I think that's one big difference, is that I think we were incorporating slightly more service user voice. But yeah, it was interesting, the comment on the behavior, and how sort of like the child had nothing to complain about. And I think that lends in with sort of stereotypes of very experienced children sort of having these behavioral issues and creating something out of nothing. I mean, obviously they had no concept of trauma-informed care 200, 300 years ago. But clearly that's not clearly, but that's the way that I read into that sort of interaction.
Yes, I mean, that's a really important point. I mean, in its earliest period, the circumstances of the mothers, very occasionally the father, but the circumstance of the mother was absolutely acute. Destitution was being faced, and it was a daily fight for survival. And as was pointed out also, there was no sort of insulation from disease or other consequences of destitution. It was even common for there to be infanticide in the circumstances where mothers were unable to care. So that is a very particular overriding context, which is very different from today. But I think we have John Caldecott with us. John, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but I'm putting you on the spot here, which is, the question has been raised about, were there any children from diverse backgrounds when you were growing up in the Foundling Hospital? That, of course, having been around the Second World War, which perhaps had a very different type of context.
When I knew I was going to attend this, I had a quick look at some of the history of people with different complexions. And it's interesting that during the 30s and 40s, there was almost a decline in the number of people from Asia and the like coming into the country. And it raised the question with me because in Berkhamsted, there was little sign of any children apart from, as we call them, white children. However, having said that, from a personal experience, one of my foster brothers clearly had the features of somebody who came from Japan, and another of the foster brothers clearly had features of what would have been an American. But there, to my knowledge, and I've asked around subsequent to knowing I was coming here, none of us can remember any child who you could call black. And there were very few children of skins other than more or less white. I mean, I hate using these expressions of white and black, but the answer is there weren't any. And so I then started looking at, well, why was that? Because certainly after the First World War brought lots of people from different countries into the UK, and secondly, the Second World War did the same, and they served in the forces. Are we saying there were no circumstances where children from these people actually weren't eligible, if you like to put it, to be taken into the Foundling Hospital? There must have been, but at the moment I can't find any evidence or any backup as to what the sort of policies were with the Foundling Hospital. It could be simply that these children from different areas were not offered to the Foundling Hospital. And of course, as we went into the 50s, the whole system of social care changed anyhow, and local authorities became responsible for illegitimate children. And so, as we know, the history of the Foundling Hospital changed considerably. So the answer is, while I was at Berkhamsted from 1942 to 1952, there were no children that you could call of colour.
Okay, thank you, John. Hannah, you probably haven't been able to follow any of that part of our story. And as I say, as you pointed out, our records may well not have captured this information. So, I mean, John's memory and the memory of those who were there is really important. And of course, some of that has been captured in both oral testimony and the Foundling Voices project, because the record keeping changed. Anthony, what did inspire you in fiction, for example? You've pointed out about what you describe as the lack of role models for you growing up. Although Lem, of course, hate to tell him this, but he is of a different generation from yourself. Who has inspired you during that period, and what more could we be doing to support that?
That's a great question. I feel like I've always really been into superheroes, so I always really did like sort of the Spider-Man, Superman kind of narratives, because I guess I maybe saw myself unconsciously in that, and the idea of overcoming a lot of things. What I can say about recently and sort of my healing journey is that reading Lord of the Rings has been so amazing for sort of, I don't even know, like processing like the importance of grief and patience and kindness and sort of like celebrating your history. And I really wish I'd read it earlier because I feel like it would have been extremely helpful in sort of, I don't know, the entire mythology of Lord of the Rings. Like one of the, I'm getting technical here, but like one of the main sort of angels in it is literally dedicated to the sort of emotion of sorrow and grief, and how from that sorrow comes wisdom and sort of patience and forbearance. And for me, that has just been so helpful, knowing that like what was unbearable circumstances for someone like me to have endured as a child. I can be sad about that and I can process that, and from that comes a sort of wisdom and maturity from that.
Yes.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings would be my choice.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I was just going to link one of the points you made around peer support. And one of the things that so many looked after children say to me when I see them, and indeed adoptees, is that they feel they're the only one. And that sort of sense of otherness and loneliness and isolation with the experience. And that contrasts actually with something, John, you've said to me before about the experience of being in the group of children. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on that. So the sort of peer support element that you felt.
Yes, there certainly was. We were, the one thing about the Foundling Hospital was that the children were all treated the same regardless. And so we were a group of children who, to us, the Foundling Hospital was our family. We were there for 10 years from the age of 5 to 15, and that was our family. And there were difficulties as children left that environment, although there was still support from the Foundling Hospital. But certainly from that time on, from leaving school and right to the present day, the children who attended the Foundling Hospital in Berkhamsted certainly regard themselves as part of a group of children that are part of a large family. And you know, when we get together, there's a camaraderie between these children, which is quite unique in many ways. I say children, grown-ups now, which is actually quite unique and which I never find in any other group of people.
Thank you, John. And Irene has needed to leave us, but she did leave us with a thought about, which is not wishing to set one group of children against another, but noting that the invisibility of adoptees in particular has a relationship perhaps to the perception of adopted children somehow having not been in care or having moved in a more kind of lucky way into a family compared to those young people who are leaving care. And yet what I observe is the similarity and the fact that it's very difficult for agencies actually to connect either young people leaving care or young adoptees with each other. So almost like some of the protections that have been put into place also mean that it's very hard to further those connectivities. Does that ring true, Anthony?
Yeah, sort of responding to both sort of you and John's point, I've really found that I was adopted at 20 months. So like before I could speak or really have any sort of concept myself. But there has always been this concept of family and having a foster family that has really stuck with me in going back, seeing like my foster family who are just amazing people who cared for me. But also like when I left, they sort of gave me this football with all of their names written on them. And it's always been like, I consider it one of my families, you know, and I've got about 4 other ones. So there's a lot to contend with. But I think the contrast is that once you get adopted, there seems to be, I just think the profound emotion or sort of context is disconnection, and you do get this new family, but I don't really remember having any sort of community figure or role model in my life who was an adoptee. And I talk to other adoptees and we kind of get this exact same thing where we get to our early 20s and we finally find this community. It would have been something that would have been so helpful when we were younger. So I just think peer support, where you can meet with people who know what you're going through, not exactly, but have those same, can empathize with your emotion, that you feel, is so key. And there needs to be things done by adoption agencies where once a child is adopted, of course, they don't have like permission to contact the child, but if they had something that could incentivize the child's or the child's parents, like, for example, support groups where the child, or the parents could organize that for them or have something to go to, is so important.
Thank you. I don't know whether you are there, Elaine, and I don't want to put you too much on the spot. That's Elaine Dibben, but she's noting that there appears to be much greater opportunity in the modern era through social media, for example, for young people to find a platform. And yet these eternal feelings still seem to continue. Are you there, Elaine? What would you comment on that?
I am, and I suppose that's what I was just. It just struck me really that if you kind of look back, then people couldn't find, as Anthony was just saying, quite difficult to find people who shared your experiences, and that's one thing. It seems to, there's lots of potential dangers of social media, obviously, but I think it is possible now to kind of go online and find stories that are being told that are, people are able to kind of just put up their own stories to sort of look, I guess to share experiences without that being in any way filtered by adults. That's and so hopefully that's a little bit easier than sort of not seeing anybody out there who kind of seems to have had the same experiences as you. The other thing I just wanted to say, Anthony, is I think that adoption agencies are much more aware now of the need for support groups for adopted young people. And I think most regional adoption agents would have something in place for that. I think one of the challenges that they find is sometimes it's more difficult as young people go into their sort of teens to motivate them to come to these organised activities because there's a lot of other things going on for them. But I think we are getting better at giving young people those opportunities.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And yes, I agree. I've done a lot of work with agencies to try and help them sort of develop an offering, and also to understand why people aren't coming to their sort of to the things that they put on. And I just think it's really important that you've got people with lived experience running those things, and that you offer things that are also really meaningful. So if I would run sort of a peer support network, I'd also focus on things like getting employment and helping find birth records. Because I know I've been in lots of adoptee sort of setting, adoptee setting, that there is an appetite for this stuff. It just needs to be calibrated. And that sort of what you're saying about social media, exactly what In Between Lines is trying to do. And we're just about to, so we've got our own website, inbetweenlines.co.uk, and our sort of own social offering. And the entire point of that is to mission people to tell their stories, and so that we can have more stories of success and hard work and overcoming, and also peace and ease and healing. Because I feel like a lot of these narratives are one of struggle and of overcoming things, and you can see that in literature as well. There's always like that struggle to find your identity, but I really think it's important for people to have ease and peace in their lives. So yeah, thank you.
And I have had a look at your website, and it looks great. So I wish you lots of success going forward with that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. I can see Carolyn. I don't know, Carolyn Sampies, if you're there. whether what has been said resonates to the work in the health context. You know, how you see the resonance and relevance here of a sense of voice.
Absolutely. I don't know if you can hear me okay. I mean, I thought that was great, Anthony. That's really makes us just stop and think. And we tend to go along thinking that we're doing all of the right things. But I think that's a real challenge to have a meaningful way of listening to the voice of care experienced young people and adults, and I know there are some good groups where they begin to have a peer support group when they're quite a bit younger, and that really seems to help later on, in that some of those groups will keep going. But I do know that the funding for certainly there was a group in Wales, and the funding just wasn't there, and it was picked up by a different group again. But I think we need to be putting much more importance into this, getting to hear the voice, because we're never going to get things right if it's just based on what we think we should be doing. That we really need to be listening to the voice, I think, as you say, Anthony. And I haven't had a chance to look at your website, but I will do so. I mean, I don't know if that really helps, Carol, but I would say that we just need to keep ahead of the game a bit, and just sort of see if there are some really good ways of attracting young people to tell us exactly what we should be doing. It was really interesting that you said that when you looked around some of the agencies, that Coram was the only one that had something that you could see quite quickly. Yes, I think would be, you know, very interesting. I know Elaine said, I think agencies are much better now, and I'm sure that's true, but that doesn't mean that we're there. So I think, you know, just a good wake-up call, really. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I don't want to, I know agencies are working as hard as they can and are putting on some really good stuff. My sister, sorry, my sister is like a social worker, so I understand how difficult it is. Yeah, it just seems to be, I think the reason why it's so hard is because it's such a deeply embedded issue, and there has to be like a fundamental change in what sort of constitutes a successful adoption. What does that look like? And fundamentally changing the way that we interact with children after they get adopted, and making sure that there are things on for them, even if no one turns up for the first couple months. It's just about having that option. Like, I get it. Like, I was an adopted teen. I didn't want to go to anything that my parents suggested. But just having the option for something, and also having like something creative and that was like interesting and would actually help in terms of like employment or connecting with people. I think that's all it takes, is to just have it there permanently. It shouldn't be like a funding based thing for a couple of years and then the funding dries up. It needs to be like something that is as part of the offering, you know. But that's going to take time, and it's going to take system changing. And yeah, I'm just appreciative that people like, I know, talking to people, that people know this in the field, and it's just, we just got to be patient and keep pushing.
So we have the challenge of an intersection here, and I think one of the really powerful things about what you are doing and trying to do, Anthony, with In Between Lines, is to look at this identity in between lines, wherever these lines may be drawn, because they are the navigation of identity issues for young people, whether they are leaving care, in care, adopted, long-term fostering, kinship, you know, that navigation. But what is one of the complexities that I was getting at there, Carolyn, is the issue between age and stage. So you might be of an age, but not of a stage. For
absolutely, yeah, and
pick up, you know, wanting to explore one's records or not.
Yes,
so,
yes,
so valid. Wanting to engage with other people in a discussion or not. And the other being the perceptual overlay there. Well, you're not old enough to do that. Or that feeling of protectiveness, whether that's from foster carers or agencies or adoptive parents. One very wise friend once said to me, your children do everything you did, but they do it 3 years earlier. Which I thought was a very wise thing. So a warning to any of you with teenagers, it's already too late by then. Does that resonate? You know, it's the question of when, you know, you don't have to want something. You don't have to want to do something at a particular stage. I often wonder why we're all so obsessed that GCSEs have to be sat when you're 16.
Yeah.
Example. Does it matter? Does it matter if you take them when you're 21? Not really. Yeah. So there's probably no answer to that, but Carolyn?
But I think that the message really is that this sort of support and way of dipping in and out needs to be available throughout the whole journey. And for some care experienced young people, it is very early on, and for some it is quite a lot later. And as Anthony said, that there shouldn't be a funding issue, really. You know, that everyone should understand that this should be part and parcel of being in care, part of the adoption journey, that this easy access in and out, dipping in and out should be there. But I guess what we need to do is be really good at providing something early on, because what tends to happen is that people don't have the opportunity of speaking to other like-minded young people, and they have problems later on, and they think it's their problem that other people don't have it. And then we get into the issue of, can we get help for this young person? No, it's really hard, not sure that they want the help. But had it been an easy way in and way out earlier on, then they probably would receive better help at the right time for them.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carolyn. Yes, and you know, there is something that we were exploring about the difference of experience in between the generations. So the generation of young people who were adopted or entered care after 1976, or certainly after 1989, because it was not until the 1989 Children Act really that there was a real change. Elaine, I'm looking to you to tell me if I'm wrong about this, but really the Children Act of 1989 was such a very important moment in terms of a much greater recognition of a voice and consultation with children and young people themselves. That felt like a long journey to get to it, but potentially a different experience from the world of certainly pre-1976. With that sense of forced adoption or relinquishment, depending on what terminology one is looking at. Did you want to comment on that, Anthony?
Yeah, I think, again, the whole sort of in-between lines, intersectional sort of thing, it's to do with just, there is no one single adoption story, and regardless of that, then the support needs to be always there. I know, just from my sort of lived experience, I wanted to explore my adopted identity apparently from the age of 6 when I first started asking my dad about DNA tests. Then I know as soon as I got to secondary school, I was like, not mention that I'm adopted. I just want to have like a normal, I just want to be normal, you know? And there's always been this kind of negotiation between trying to work out whether, you know, adoption is something I want to be actively exploring or something I want to let go. And now I've got to the point where I feel like I've healed and I've done all of that. But what there needs to be through that is continuously the option to turn and get support if needed. Because I know that when I was younger and I wanted to, you know, I talked to my parents and were like, where are any adoptees? Can I talk to them? Or why is no one else like me? Why can't I answer the question, where are you from? You know, there should have been more stuff there. And again, yeah, I feel like people getting to understand that. But it's just in the midst of all these different intersectionalities, all these different stories, there is, I think, an obligation for there to be constant support so that adoptees can feel that sense of safety and community that was taken away from them by no fault of their own. And I'm glad that we're all finally having a conversation, because that's what needs to change.
Thank you, Anthony. So just pulling ourselves back to think about these voices through time, Paul has made two useful comments on the chat about those experiences in literature, in Wuthering Heights, in Tom Jones and so on, and how the term foundling is not explained. And of course, the foundlings who were in the Foundling Hospital were not found. They were, what would be the word, John, presented or petitioned for, actually, a very active act, as opposed to, you know, being sort of discovered in some way. And that isn't explained. We have made a documentary film, which is actually been produced with research and engagement by young people who are carry experienced today. It's called No Place Like Home, and it touches upon that and what Thomas Coram was doing in using the term Foundling Hospital, and how those changes have, you know, have developed over time. So please do, as we come to a close for this evening, please do join us if you would like to continue this discussion. This tonight is the start of this discussion, which must be amplified and furthered, and the celebration of young people's voices and the recognition of the voicelessness that still occurs and which has occurred and always potentially will occur within the lines of record keeping, which are there to serve particular institutional or social norms and needs. But we are exploring further the story of the Foundling Hospital and its legacy with a film screening of the documentary No Place Like Home, which is taking place on Monday, the 20th of November, 6 to 7:15, again on Zoom. The film is available for you to view at any time online, so you, of course, are most welcome to do so. But we will be hosting a screening on the 20th of November because it is World Children's Day, and also to enable those who have helped to reveal and support those stories. It includes and features further input from Hannah, which is lovely, and her work in the archive. And I hope that you will join us. We also, you can discover more about the work and the records and the digitization program and Coram's history as the Foundling Hospital through the Coram Story website, where you can find useful links to the transcription program that is still ongoing. We hope that you have enjoyed this evening's discussion, and I would really very much like to thank both Hannah and Anthony for bringing to bear the different voices through time and beginning to start with us the continuing journey of ensuring that voicelessness and invisibility are tackled and that our foundlings are never forgotten. So with that, I shall thank you for your attendance tonight and draw our meeting to a close. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thank
for
you.
listening,
Thank you.
guys.
Everyone.
Thank you.